I look back when I started in 1990, 1991, we had environmental assessments, Navigable Waters Protection Act, the Fisheries Act, we had science at the forefront of public discourse, and you know, that's what I was trained in, and that's where I began work. And now I look, and all of that's gone.
It was when I had the opportunity to go to law school with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Bobby, as my law professor, that I became completely hooked. With Bobby's mentorship and guidance, I was able to represent the Hudson Riverkeeper on 3 or 4 big files on the Hudson River, and that was it. I got a taste for what it is to be a waterkeeper, and I was in the movement. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our wonderful, fearless leader, the president of Waterkeeper Alliance, and my hero, Robert F. Kennedy. Thank you.
Canada, for us, has always been kind of the moral paradigm of nations. You know, it was famous for its humanity, for its commitment to future generations, for its openness to the rest of the world, and for really just a strong sense of community among Canadians and among the rest of the world. I'm not just saying that. I used to get invited about every 2 years by the Alberta Oil and Gas Association to do the keynote address at their annual meeting, and you know, that kind of thing would be unthinkable in the United States. There's no way that I would be invited by ANGA or you know the American Petroleum Institute or any of these people. I would be shunned by them. But the Canadian oil people, you know, I'd be sitting there saying, you know, you guys are destroying the planet, and they'd be going, yeah, we are. we gotta stop. We gotta stop. Tell us how to stop. And then it was really just like this extraordinary sense of community that I loved, you know. And I think of the United States as kind of the 14th province of Canada. I wish we were more Canadian until you elected Stephen Harper, and then it all went south. And I have to say, a few years ago, you know, you had this great law called the Fisheries Act, and Mark and I sued Detroit Edison, a U.S. company. It made it illegal and criminal, in fact. We could do private criminal prosecutions. And Mark was the first one to do this. We did them all over Canada, and his mentor, the FRASER Riverkeeper, we did them on rivers all over Canada, and we stopped people from polluting. And then we said, let's sue a U.S. company that is putting mercury in the air and dumping it in Canadian waterways. We sued Detroit Edison, and we shut them down. We won the conviction. It was really amazing. But now, you know, now that law is gone. And all of these other laws that protected the democratic process and democracy and the environment are intertwined. You know, you can't separate one from the other. People ask me at the thing today, what do you do to protect the environment? I say restore democracy. As long as these big incumbents, the carbon cronies, are subverting our democracy and turning government into a tool to serve their mercantile interests rather than serving the interests of the public, we're not going to have an environment or democracy. And you have to really restore the democracy first so that government begins to function for the sake of people with a moral responsibility to our children, and that is that's not happening today. And it's really sad to me that Canada, which was always the paradigm of how we're supposed to, and then BC was kind of the fulcrum of morality for the rest of Canada as well. It was a place where people valued the environment, where they said no to big polluters, even when they promised a lot of cash and you know jobs and all this other stuff. They said no, and they were right. You know, and you know, now a lot of those powers being taken away from the province, put in the hands of the federal government. A lot of these guys say we like states' rights or provincial rights, but they only like that when it allows, because the corporations can so easily dominate the provincial landscapes or the state landscape, political landscape. So, and then when the province is against them, like, you know, in the case of British Columbia, then they say, okay, the federal law is here to protect, you know, corporate interest. So it's really just about corporate control. It really isn't any kind of coherent conservative philosophy. And it is not about democracy, because they've taken the democracy. And, you know, we pioneered this whole area when we elected George Bush and other oil. It's not good to elect oil men to run your country, okay? Let's just make that great. I love corporations, but they should not be running our government. You know, because you know, a corporation does not want for Canada what Canadians want for Canada. Corporations are designed to want profits, and it's just different. That doesn't mean they're bad, but it does mean that we shouldn't be letting them run our governments, either in the U.S. or Canada. It should be run by people, by human beings, and you know, we're self-governed. This is a big experiment in self-government, and we don't want to, you know, we don't want to create the kind of corporate plutocracy or corporate kleptocracy, which is now what we've got in both of our countries. But, you know, Lauren, I've known for 10 years, she started, or longer than that. She started the Waterkeeper up here. And I want to say just this very briefly for those who aren't familiar with our movement. I met a guy tonight called Dave Salmon who came here to support the Waterkeepers, and he said that he told me he was a Marine, he was a Canadian, but he was inspired by my uncle to join the Marines back in 1963. And he joined and he served in Vietnam, a very, very tough part of Vietnam in 64 and 65. And I said to him, you know, that this organization was founded by Marines, and it was, and we still have strong connections to the U.S. Marine Corps. And it was started by a group of Marines in 1966 who were also commercial fishermen on the Hudson River. And they came back from Vietnam and some from Korea. And they saw that the waterway, they lived in a little village 30 miles north of New York City, an enclave of the commercial fishery called Crotonville, New York. And these weren't, you know, these were people who had little expectation that they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the national parks. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beach, the swimming holes, the fishing holes, the Hudson. It was their livelihood. It was their property values. It was their recreation. And the river was being destroyed by polluters. In 1964, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton Harmon Rail Yard. It went up the river, blackened the beaches. It made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't earn a living. Couldn't sell them at the Fulton Fish Market. And all of the people in Crotonville was the most patriotic village in the United States. Virtually the entire male population had the highest mortality rate in World War II of any community in our country. The entire male population joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants. They were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence because they saw something that they thought they owned. The purity of the Hudson waters and the abundance of its fisheries. And it was being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they went to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, the Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, the Conservation Department, and they were given the bum's rush. The Corps colonel told Richie Garrett, a Marine, a combat veteran from Vietnam, who was the first president of Waterkeeper. He was a gravedigger from Ossining, New York, and he used to tell his new followers, "I'll be the last to let you down." He went to New York City, and he begged the Corps of Engineers colonel, to do his job and shut down that Penn Central pipe. The Corps colonel finally told him in exasperation, "These are important people. We can't treat them that way." Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, in other words, we can't force them to comply with the law. This is called agency capture phenomena, where the agencies that are supposed to protect us become sock puppets for the polluters that they're supposed to regulate. And they came out of that meeting and they went home. They had a meeting, 300 people in the American Legion Hall in Crotonville, New York, and they started talking about violence, about rolling up a mattress and jamming it up the Penn Central pipe and flooding the rail yard with its own weight, putting a match to the oil slick coming out of the pipe, floating a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens, taking food off their family tables. Then a guy stood up who was a writer for Sports Illustrated, a great fisherman, and he had discovered an ancient navigational law that was identical to the Fisheries Act in this country, where you could sue polluters and collect bounties. And whoever turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. Nobody, in 80 years, it was the 1888 law. Nobody had ever collected a bounty on it. And these guys said, Bob Boyle was this fisherman, famous angler, written half a dozen books on fly fishing and angling. He said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law, we should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that they were going to start a group called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, later became Riverkeeper, go out and track down every polluter on the Hudson, and they just started winning thousands of dollars in bounties. They got $200,000 in one lawsuit in 1973. They used the money against Anaconda Wire and Cables, dumping toxics into the Hudson from Dobbs Ferry in New York. They used that money to construct a boat. They used bounty money to hire their first full-time riverkeeper. They used bounty money to hire me in 1984 as their attorney. Since then, we've brought over 500 successful lawsuits, forced the polluters to spend $500 million remediating the river. And as a result of our work, the Hudson today is the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic north of the equator. It's the last major river system that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of fish. And the resurrection, the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired the creation of all these water keepers around the world, lake keepers, stream keepers, river keepers. And particularly in Canada, it caught on. And we now are the fastest growing water protection group in the world. As I said, we're in 30. We have 7 in China. We have 7 in Russia. We have 11 in India. We have 17 in Australia. We had 29 in Latin America. And we're growing exponentially. And, you know, but the Canadian keepers, and particularly the Fraser River keeper, is a paradigm for what everybody else is doing. And once a year, we all get together and they teach each other, you know, ways to protect the environment. And they recognize that first 2 things, and I'll shut up, the waterways belong to the people. They don't belong to the government. They don't belong to the big shots. They belong to all the people. This is ancient law. It goes back to the Code of Justinian. It's in the Magna Carta. It's in the Constitution of every state and the province of Canada. The waterways of British Columbia belong to the people of British Columbia. The fisheries belong to the people. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody can use them in a way that will injure or diminish their use and enjoyment by others. Every child in this city, whether they're native or Asian or white or black or rich or poor or humble or noble, has the right to go down to that harbor or the local river, pull out a salmon, bring it home and feed it to their family with the security that they're not going to poison somebody, and with the assurance that the fish are going to be there when they're supposed to be there. And that right has been stolen when somebody pollutes that water or destroys the riparian buffer zones and floods it with sediments so the salmon eggs don't take. That is an act of theft. They are stealing. They're breaking the law. They're not allowed to do that. And they're breaking the law and they're stealing something from the rest of us. And they need to be treated as thieves when they do that. And, you know, a lot of people in the United States, the reason we started, we're a law enforcement organization. You know, we say, tell people this is breaking the law. And a lot of people say, well, it's environmental law. It's not real law. Right? There's no victims. But there are. It's a victim law. It's a victim crime. If you have a fish, now every freshwater fish in the United States now has mercury in it from coal-burning power plants. And the same is true for most of Canada. You know, they haven't done as extensive testing here. But every freshwater fish, according to the National Academy of Sciences. So if a pregnant mother eats one of those fish, or a little girl, and that girl gets to maybe 4th or 5th grade, and because of that mercury, a single molecule of mercury caused brain damage. Because of that mercury in her brain, lost IQ points. That little girl can't read as well as she's supposed to. And she can't solve the math problem with the efficacy that the rest of the kids in her class can. And God gave her the brain to solve that problem, to read that book. But that coal company took it away from her. And that's child abuse. And it's you know, it's assault and battery. And robbing that little child of self-esteem and robbing that little child of her health, you know, is as bad as any crime that you know, a robber going into a store, into a bank and you know, and stealing all the money. It's worse than that. And we ought to be prosecuting this crime, but it never gets prosecuted that way. And that's one of the things that Waterkeeper Alliance does. And we have this extraordinary team in Canada with Mark leading it and Lauren and people like Lauren on rivers all over. But we need support from our communities, and we need support from the kind of leadership that we see in this room. And we need to spread this movement to every waterway in Canada and the ethic that we bring with us. Mark doesn't have any laws left to enforce now because they've been eviscerated. Well, but he's going to figure out other ways to protect the rivers up here and the waterways for this generation, for next generation. And I have 6 kids, and I've had to put them through school. I wish, and they got into decent schools so far, and those schools are really expensive. And I wish I'd just taken that money and put it into preserving the rivers. So no matter how badly they screw up their lives, at least they'll be able to go fishing and get something to eat and feed their families. Right now, 4 of them are still on my payroll, and I'm trying to get them off. And if I knew the fish were safe to eat, I'd just give them a fishing rod and tell them, figure it out. But anyway, thank you all for coming here. You've been wonderful supporters.